9 days after burying my husband, I found myself alone at the kitchen table, completely dry-eyed and fully composed. The house still carried the heavy, suffocating fragrance of decaying funeral lilies, but my entire focus had narrowed down to a yellow legal pad and a cold calculator. Christopher was gone, yet the ghost he left behind wasn't made of memories or grief. It was made of numbers. I had just uncovered the catastrophic financial collapse of Vanguard Distribution Corporation, the company he had devoted his entire life to building, and there were no more tears left in me, only a ledger that needed to be balanced. Our marriage had lasted 25 years, a quarter century constructed on what I genuinely believed was mutual respect, a shared vision, and parallel ambition. I had built Apex Logistics Solutions from nothing, transforming it into a powerhouse of reliability and operational efficiency, while Christopher kept Vanguard deliberately walled off from my world. He always framed it as professional wisdom, a safeguard against concentrated risk. I respected that boundary completely, reading it as the mark of two sophisticated executives who understood how to manage exposure. But sitting there with his private ledgers open in front of me, I finally understood the elaborate architecture of blind spots he had been quietly constructing right under my nose for years. Looking back, the warning signs had always been present. A vendor payment delayed without real explanation, a slightly defensive response to a routine question about cash flow, a closed office door that hadn't always been closed. These are the mechanics of what I now call cruel normalization, the way danger rises so gradually that you stop sensing the temperature change entirely. You absorb the minor inconsistencies. You accept the guarded answers. You tell yourself these are simply the complexities of a high-functioning executive life, and before you realize it, the absurd has become completely ordinary. The red flags were always there, waving openly, but they had been woven so seamlessly into the texture of daily life that they simply looked like part of the pattern. Christopher understood exactly how my mind worked, and he exploited it with surgical precision. He knew I operated on logic, so he always had a logical answer ready. He used my deep belief in our partnership as a shield, constructing an entirely separate reality just beyond my line of sight. I never looked at him with the same clinical scrutiny I applied to my quarterly audits, because I didn't think I needed to. I had unknowingly served as the silent foundation of his grand illusion, providing stability, credibility, and an impeccable public reputation while he operated freely in the shadows beneath it all. I pressed my fingers against my eyes, not out of sorrow, but to sharpen my concentration. My anger wasn't the kind that screams or shatters things. It was quiet, precise, and entirely focused. Love, I now understood, had been a contract. I was finally reading the clauses I had never been shown. The truth didn't arrive through a tearful phone call or a dramatic late-night confession. It pulled into my driveway on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. I watched through the front window as a silver sedan with Michigan plates parked cleanly along the hedgerow. My mind registered the anomaly before my emotions could process the intrusion. A woman climbed out of the driver's seat, late 30s, dressed with a careful, rehearsed composure that made it obvious she had replayed this moment many times in her head. But it wasn't the woman who stopped my breath. It was the small boy holding her hand. He was 7 years old, and he had Christopher's eyes. Exactly. The same slight angle, the same unmistakable shade of hazel, a biological echo standing on my front porch. I opened the door before she could knock. She introduced herself as Amanda. There was no remorse in her face, only a posture of delayed entitlement, the bearing of someone who believed she was finally collecting what was owed to her. She walked into my foyer carrying a thick, perfectly organized leather folder and moved through my home not as a visitor entering a house of mourning, but as someone clearing a bureaucratic obstacle on her way to something larger. We sat across from each other in the formal living room. She placed the folder on the glass coffee table and opened it with deliberate, practiced precision. Inside was a 14-year-old ceremonial marriage program with glossy photographs of Christopher beaming on a beach I had never seen, standing beside a bride who was most certainly not me. Behind it sat dense stacks of correspondence, utility records, and holiday cards. 14 years. A parallel life running simultaneously and silently alongside mine. While I was managing logistics networks and negotiating commercial contracts in Charlotte, he had been playing husband and father in Michigan. She slid the documents toward me across the table, watching my expression carefully, hunting for the crack, the sob, the collapse. She needed my breakdown to confirm her own significance. I gave her nothing. I simply looked at the paperwork. This wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a hostile acquisition attempt, and I do not lose negotiations. Amanda settled comfortably into my sofa cushions with the ease of someone delivering a long overdue verdict. Then she began to speak, and I recognized every word as Christopher's carefully authored script. With a tone of practiced, condescending sympathy, she described me as the cold, immovable corporate obstacle that had made his real life impossible. She explained that he had only remained in our marriage out of professional duty, that what they had was genuine human connection, a sanctuary where he could simply be himself. She believed every word she was saying because he had spent years painting me as the villain of his story to justify his own moral failures to her. I absorbed her monologue without interruption or reaction. I didn't defend my marriage or my character. I let her talk because listening was data collection. After roughly 10 minutes, I stood, politely excused myself, and walked directly to my home office. I closed the door behind me with a quiet, firm click, picked up my phone, and called Matthew, my corporate defense and estate attorney. I told him I needed an immediate, exhaustive cross-reference of every public record in Michigan against Vanguard Distribution's corporate filings spanning the last 14 years. I wanted every shell entity, every concealed asset, every shadow account fully exposed by morning. The season of grieving was over. I was now the chief executive of my own survival, and I was about to conduct the most important audit of my life. Matthew arrived at my office the following morning at 7. The legal framework he laid across my conference table was stark and binary. Amanda's ceremonial beach wedding carried no legal standing whatsoever under state public records law. She was, in every enforceable sense, a legal fiction. However, the 7-year-old boy, Jacob, held undeniable standing as a biological heir. His claim to a portion of Christopher's estate was legitimate and legally binding, and Amanda understood that leverage intimately. When she realized I wasn't going to collapse under the weight of scandal or hand over anything voluntarily, she changed tactics. She went to the press. By Friday afternoon, a carefully constructed narrative had spread aggressively across local news platforms, community forums, and social media. The story she planted was engineered for maximum public outrage. A powerful, wealthy logistics executive using elite legal resources to deny a grieving, fatherless child his modest rightful inheritance. Reporters flooded Apex Logistics with calls. A news van took up permanent residence across the street from our corporate campus. The pressure campaign had one clear objective: force me into a quiet settlement to stop the public bleeding. Amanda and the media fundamentally misread the person they were dealing with. They expected capitulation. What they encountered was silence and preparation. I directed Matthew to issue a strict no comment on all press inquiries and instructed my team to initiate a complete forensic liability audit of Vanguard Distribution. I wanted every buried debt, every defaulted obligation, every toxic hidden liability Christopher had concealed behind his polished exterior, fully documented and quantified. She wanted his legacy. I was going to ensure she received every last piece of it. The forensic audit confirmed what I had suspected. Vanguard wasn't just struggling, it was structurally diseased at its core, but one critical element remained missing from the full picture. As legal spouse and primary corporate guarantor, I exercised my statutory right to access Christopher's private downtown office, accompanied by a court-appointed marshal. I bypassed the standard filing cabinets and went directly to the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor of his private closet. I already knew the combination. He had used my exact birthday. A remarkably careless choice for a man managing so many layered secrets. Beneath a stack of expired passports and outdated property deeds sat a single sealed manila envelope. I broke the seal and extracted a pristine set of private banking documents. The header at the top of the first page read, "Final Transfer Authorization." 4 days before his death, Christopher had authorized an irrevocable wire transfer of $1,200,000 to the absolute last liquid reserves of Vanguard Distribution. The destination was a domestic asset protection trust established quietly under my personal name years earlier and left completely dormant until this final transaction. I stared at the figure without moving. He had known. Either he sensed his heart was failing, or he had recognized that the financial walls were finally closing in. In his final act, he had deliberately stripped Vanguard of every remaining dollar of real value and transferred it beyond the reach of probate courts and corporate creditors, entirely into my name. He had intentionally left his secret family a hollowed-out corporate shell drowning in catastrophic debt. This single discovery dismantled every remaining fragment of complexity I had been carrying about him. He hadn't protected Amanda. He hadn't protected Jacob. He had protected his own image, his own legacy, and ensured that I would remain financially intact while leaving his devoted mistress to inherit a burning structure. He didn't love her. He simply used her, just as he had used everything else. This changed my entire endgame. I was no longer fighting to protect a share. I was simply stepping back and allowing gravity to complete its inevitable work. The probate hearing fell on a gray, rain-soaked Thursday morning. The marble courthouse corridor hummed with reporters and camera operators drawn in by Amanda's sustained media offensive. She and her attorney Nicholas stood prominently near the courtroom entrance, smiling for the cameras with the confidence of people about to claim an uncontested prize. They expected a battle. They expected dramatic legal maneuvers and impassioned objections. I sat beside Matthew at the defense table with a perfectly straight posture and an entirely unreadable expression. The judge reviewed the initial petition documents. Nicholas approached the podium and delivered his demand with theatrical conviction, the immediate provisional transfer of Vanguard Distribution's controlling shares to his client as legal guardian of the biological heir. The room seemed to suspend itself, waiting for my objection. Instead, I turned to Matthew, gave a barely visible nod, rose from my chair, walked to the applicant's table, and signed the provisional transfer documents with my own pen. Complete, uncontested, silent. The room went absolutely still. Nicholas accepted the signed documents with a wide, self-satisfied smile. Then his junior associate began working through the certified corporate balance sheets attached to the back of my transfer agreement. Her face changed instantly. She whispered urgently into Nicholas's ear, her words rapid and panicked. I watched the color leave his face in real time. His hands began to tremble as he read the cross-collateralization clauses buried in the fine print. This is the defining illusion of an empty prize. When people become obsessed with the optics of winning, with the title, the public victory, the symbolic keys, they forget entirely to inspect what those keys actually open. By loudly demanding and legally accepting the provisional transfer, Nicholas and Amanda hadn't claimed a valuable asset. They had triggered the immediate foreclosure of a corporate entity carrying $5,200,000 in default obligations, tax liens, broken union agreements, defaulted vendor credit lines, and substantial real estate arrears. They were now personally and irrevocably liable for every cent of the catastrophe Christopher had carefully concealed. They had demanded the crown with maximum public fanfare, and I had simply and quietly locked it around their necks. I stood behind my floor-to-ceiling office windows at Apex Logistics, looking out across a rain-washed Charlotte skyline slowly clearing into the evening. The storm had passed. Everything was sharp and still and clean. Across town, Vanguard Distribution entered immediate administrative liquidation. Amanda's carefully engineered public narrative had collapsed overnight. She now found herself trapped inside the wreckage of her own performance, watching courts systematically seize her assets to satisfy Christopher's creditors, destroyed by the choices of a man who had ultimately left her nothing but a structure on fire. But I drew a clean line at innocent casualties. Before leaving the courthouse that morning, I had instructed Matthew to establish an anonymous, irrevocable education trust for Jacob, overseen by a court-appointed guardian entirely insulated from Amanda's reach. The boy would have a real future. His mother would never access a single dollar of it. I watched the city lights come on in the deepening dusk and thought about the real architecture of freedom. True autonomy isn't about winning arguments in public, it's about removing yourself entirely from equations that were never designed to serve you. Carrying anger is simply another way of letting someone else occupy rent-free space in your own mind. And forgiveness, I've come to understand, isn't always extended for the other person's benefit. Sometimes it is simply the most efficient way to reclaim yourself. I didn't dismantle them. I simply stopped being the foundation their entire fiction was built upon.